Okay, this week I have a great opportunity, and this one came to me sort of by the wiles of Facebook trying to tell me what I'm sure I'm going to like. Facebook pointed me towards a blog posting about the Endangered Guitar as created by today's guest, Hans Tammen. Endangered Guitar is a really interesting kind of combination of standard and enhanced guitar technique with computer systems, and we're going to kind of be quizzing Hans about that, because so often we find that guitarists don't really like interacting with a computer, so it'll be interesting to hear his take on it. But with that, I'd like to introduce you to Hans. Hans, how are you this evening?
I'm great.
Thank you so much for doing the podcast with us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me here on your show.
So I am curious. When I look at your bio information, actually, you and I have interacted over the years, particularly in relationship to your work with HarvestWorks in New York. But I've known you for a while, but it was interesting when I started looking through your bio information to prepare for this podcast. I was kind of blown away by the number of different groups and ensembles that you've put together, the number of releases you've done. You've been a very busy man. And what I'm curious about, and one of the things I really like asking people, is to tell me about the background, their background, and how they got to be the artists that they are. And especially in your case, where you're constantly exploring the front edge of experimentalism, both as a solo artist and as part of an ensemble. I'm really curious what your background is and how you got where you are.
Well, let's talk about the art first, if you can separate it from the rest. I started out as a guitarist like way over 40 years ago. In the 70s, I wanted to be the new Ritchie Blackmore. In the 80s, I was playing jazz all the time. In the 90s, I was more connected with the British improviser scene, a certain kind of style that prides itself in, fast reactions, very sound-oriented playing stuff. And, then towards the end of the 90s, when you play sounds, when you draw sounds and noises from the guitar, and when you want to expand your palette, when it comes to sound, the next step is really electronics, because that's what, for me, electronics is really good for timbre, sound, noises, and these things. Since roughly the year 2000, I did a lot with electronics, notably with Max MSP. And, in the last couple of years, I expanded my horizon much beyond the guitar as the instrument. Well, that kind of is my artistic background. Sure. I have a degree in adult education. In the 90s, I was a union organizer in Germany who focused on issues of video surveillance and data monitoring in the workplace. And since 2000, I have worked for 14 years for HarvestWorks Digital Media Art Center to help artists creating their interactive artworks, which I quit in December because I want to actually go back to teaching, and I'm glad right now that I teach at School of Visual Arts in Sarah Lawrence College. We'll see how that goes in the future.
Well, that's really pretty cool. So you're teaching in the College of Visual Arts?
Yes.
And so what is so almost everything I know about you is primarily coming from music and experimental sound. Do you have a background doing video art as well, or are you bringing kind of sound art concepts into the School of Visual Arts?
No, it's just like it's really visuals. I teach Max and processing,
Oh, I
but
see.
it's an
Okay.
art course. It's an art course for visuals. I mean, when you work at HarvestWorks, I mean, we had a long history. We have a long history as a sound art place, but in fact, the vast majority of clients that came to HarvestWorks were visual artists. So you get some understanding of visual arts, interactive arts with visuals, and so it just was very interesting. Right now, I'm also interested in expanding my horizon to that. So I'm really planning on working with a large ensemble of electronic musicians and light artists, which I had done a couple of experiments in New York already with visual artists, with light artists, laser artists who I conduct and I play with. So I'm expanding my horizon in that area today as well.
What are some of the areas of that that you're personally finding really interesting?
Uh, Personally finding interesting any kind of like maybe socially conscious data visualization. One of my students at SVA right now is working on a piece that takes live internet data from Beijing about the air pollution and maps it onto a 1,000-year-old brush painting that depicts nature, rivers, and stuff from China. And that painting is 11 meters wide, and he displaces the pixels according to the Beijing air pollution. I found this very beautiful. It's gorgeous, and it's has an interesting message that we should look at.
Sure, that sounds amazing. Now, in your time at HarvestWorks, one of the things that you kind of did was help organize and help people through the process of making their projects. And I think one of the things I think would be useful for those people who don't know much, those listeners who don't know much about HarvestWorks, is to kind of give us a quick capsule overview of what that represented.
What HarvestWorks represented?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, HarvestWorks was founded in 1977. It started out as a place that gave composers of electronic music access to synthesizers. You know, at that time, you either were part of a university or had a lot of cash in your hand to buy a synthesizer. And there were a couple of people who got together and made a non-for-profit, got these synthesizers and rented them out for $3 an hour or something like this. The next step was, of course, to record these materials. So HarvestWorks also became a recording studio. Then the next step was publish the materials, and HarvestWorks also started to have a record label, Tellus, that brought out a lot of materials over the years. And since I was there and I was riding the wave, the 2000s were the year where interactive art really took off, with like everybody having laptops and so on. And so we started selling less studio space or synthesizers or stuff that were already thrown away many years ago.
Right.
But we started selling brain power, people who know programming, people who help with building your project. And so also the education program took off a lot. And that was the time that I was there.
Right. I have been blown away by the number of different situations where I'll be performing with someone or somebody will be in town and I'll talk to them. And when we talk about the work that they're doing, they point to time spent at HarvestWorks as being the thing that launched them into their most productive or the phase that helped them develop their ultimate or at least pentultimate work. I'm thinking that you must have seen an extraordinary amount of great work coming through that place. I mean, just because I keep on running into people and they say, yeah, I did this thing at HarvestWorks, and I worked with Luke, I worked with Matt or somebody, and I've been working, that just blew my mind open. I've been working on that ever since. You must have seen, hundreds of these, right?
Well, we had good times where I had the maximum. I had 280 artists a year in a year, and that does not mean that I have been involved in depth with each of their projects. Sometimes there were only people who signed up for a class, but most of them also talked with me about what class is the right one for their project and so on. We were specialized not in like some some one-fits-all concept. We were specialized in working with artists on their individual projects. So I had a good time, yes.
Well, one of the things, you say that there's this project orientation, and I would say that that's how everybody frames it. I mean, they may have taken like some of the standard classes, but the way that the thing that they viewed as the most important work was them working on their project with the help of HarvestWorks. And this kind of goes back to what you were saying about where you change from being a center with synthesizers to being a center with brain power. And that's a really powerful twist, but something that certainly has helped an awful lot of artists make their way. Who were some of the people that were working with HarvestWorks that helped with these projects? I know Luc Dubois did some of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Luc worked for us a little bit. Then I think the bulk of the work for many years was done by Daphna Naftali and Matthew Ostrowski. Mm-hmm. And then we had people who were with us like for 2 or 3 years and then took totally off to better pastures, like Zachary Seldes, for example, Adam Roxar. Mm-hmm. And in the area of like hardware, we had Eric Singer working for us, Nicole Carroll. And that was all good stuff. And I always was trying to keep people with us for a long time because if you can trust your engineer and, at some point you just talk to the client, talk to the artist, and you send them over. And if you're lucky, you never hear from them again because they're totally taken care of by Matthew from the beginning to the end. Right?
Matthew is actually really a particular thing. He's somebody I should interview at some point because the number of people that have been touched by him is really amazing. But what's interesting to me is what the list that you gave is sort of like the roster of up and coming media tech artists. It's pretty amazing that you got to work with them, and a lot of that is because also it's New York and there's some amazing talent available there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of people who apply to work for HarvestWorks, and too bad we didn't have 10 times as much work to give to everybody. Would have been great.
Yeah. So let's talk about your work a little bit, and particularly this concept of the endangered guitar. So I read this blog post, and it was a nice but relatively short overview of what you were doing. And I'll put a link to it up on the website, but I'd like it if you could kind of explain the process of getting to where you are with that, because it's a pretty. Just the short story is pretty interesting, and I guess I would like to hear maybe the longer story.
Yeah, it was just because the almanac that it was published was in Berlin, that I did a lecture last year. They only wanted like 500 words or something like this. So I had my previous publications, I had to like seriously scale down. However, how it came, if we want to go back to the 80s, where I was a jazz guitarist, there's the main thing between what I did in the 70s and 80s and what I did after that until today is the difference between I was interested before in like melody and harmony, and after that I was interested in sound, timbre, and rhythm, and then I would also add dynamics. And how it happened was towards the end of the 80s, I was playing the usual kind of jazz stuff, and towards the end, I started to get more and more interested in these long intros or outros. These intros, especially where everybody's very careful what we're doing right now. We try to find sounds to come together, and then somebody counts in the head, and the whole energy drained out of me. Right. And so that's why I make the joke usually today that I'm only playing the intros and outros these days, and that's about it. So, and what it is behind the scenes is this change to like that my ears got bigger, more interested in timbre and in sound. Well, the first step, of course, what you do when you're a guitarist and you want to do sound, you get like all these, distortion pedals and crap like this. So remember, this was like 1990. So I bought this amazingly expensive harmonizer and the loop pedal that had a fixed loop of 2 seconds, this kind of stuff. And I had several of these things in a row, and I was like creating this amazingly loud and dense wall of noises. The problem with that is, of course, that these pedals are not dynamic at all.
Right.
It's also with this approach, you can't even sing into it, and it all makes the same sound. And nobody can play with you because you make that much noise. Like everybody else can go to the bar and drink while you're like burning the place to the ground. So I had a good time with that for a short time, but then when you want to really draw sounds off the guitar is great. When you work with gadgets, sticks, stones, mallets, motors, and stuff like this, and start getting noises out of the instrument, Fred Frith style. If you want to see who popularized that kind of like approach to the guitar, that was for us Fred Frith.
Right.
And so the next 10 years, I spent really doing that kind of guitar playing, the guitar flat on my lap, using pot scratchers, vacuum cleaners, all kinds of materials, self-made motors. I equipped the guitar with lots of other, pickups and made, these long solo concerts or play together with people that approached their instruments, like the saxophone or the percussion, the same way I approached the guitar. And again, towards the end of the 90s, what do you do? First is I was looking still for new sounds, and I started using pedals again and started complicated routings with like mixers and stuff. And, that what became just too complicated. And then all of a sudden, this shift happened where laptops became affordable and everybody had them.
Right.
And it made sense to take a laptop with you on to a performance instead of schlepping like a big desktop machine with you with monitor and stuff like this. And it was kind of normal. And many artists actually have this approach. You have a setup, and now you want to move the entire setup onto your computer. And that's what I did. I moved my setup on the computer, programming it in Max MSP. But of course, as you very well know, it didn't take longer than a month or two that you figure out what else you can do, what you would never be able to do with cables and pedals and in real life, in the real world. So I just got completely off into a different area. I got a head start, I have to say, because my usual explanation is I wanted to learn Max, so I married a Max programmer. And Daphne was already programming and teaching Max for 10 years, so I got, of course, a head start with that.
Right.
Except the rest I had to learn by myself, because the last thing what you want to do is when you come home late at night is like talking about Max MSP.
Do more Max programming, right?
Yeah. So, so that where the origins of that kind of programming are coming from, this interest and this desire of working with sonic explorations, with textures, with sound and with timbre.
So first of all, what are the kinds of effects that you used to have as pedals that you're now doing on the computer? And then what are the things that you found in the computer that were different than you would ever find in the pedals? What are some of the devices and mechanisms that you personally are part of your voice?
Well, let's say when I started programming with the idea of mimicking what I had in the real world and the virtual world, which again went down the drain within a few months, I had a couple of these complex Digitech pedals that do forwards, backwards, all kind of like weird harmonizing stuff and so on. So these were interesting, and also I didn't have any loop pedals anymore because I figured out when I use loop pedals, I use it always in moments when I'm musically weak, when I'm getting, what am I doing now? And then it's always good to press a loop and start thinking, but it always got boring. So I sold the loop pedals. It was a conscious decision to sell them so that I can be challenged and can be on the edge of my seat and not get lazy when I'm performing, which I mention right now because it's an important concept that I'm coming back to when it comes to me performing with whatever concept I'm performing with. So I had these pedals, but again, after a short period of time, those were out of the window because the first thing that I have worked on in the 2000s was sample manipulation. And you can, of course, with a computer do way more things with sample manipulation than what you can do with a loop pedal or any other kind of pedal.
Certainly.
What you can do with pedals is playing them forwards, backwards, higher and lower. But here what you cannot do is usually taking certain parts of it and rearrange a live played material and so on, and process certain parts of the sample with different parameters and so on. And I figured quickly also that I could control my parameters with my playing style, which you cannot do with pedals. And so this is where this whole thing became like interactive a little bit, so that I say it's not only the sounds that I create are the sounds that are processed, but the sounds that are created by getting some information from it, by analyzing it, are also the sounds that control the processing of the sounds. In fact, it's of course that the moment I play now, I process the sounds that I played a second ago because I have to run into a buffer. So there's always some kind of a delay in there.
Right.
But this is the basic concept how I started with, that I control my sounds, the processing of my sounds with the sounds that I'm playing.
Right. Well, that's really interesting, and that kind of rolls into something you talked about as like the areas of interest, which is dynamics, because one of the ways that you can really have an expressive kind of control system is by having a highly dynamic playing style and then a system that can respond to those high dynamics. So first of all, what are the kinds of things that you control with your playing style and with the dynamics? And how do you have to change your playing technique in order to pull it off?
I always say here I'm playing fiddle. I'm not playing guitar, I'm playing fiddle. But fiddle, although there are meanwhile other pitch and velocity trackers out there, that's the core of my patch for 15 years now. And this is what I have the feeling I somehow control, where, it's like a certain amount of like banging on the guitar. I have a feeling that I understand the response to a certain point and also how to deal with pitch. It's I mean, I have tried a lot of things, but when it comes to analyzing sound, I'm mostly still going, I'm back to mostly using pitch and velocity to control things. But let's say if you play normal guitar sound, a C sharp, that will be easily analyzed as a C sharp, but that's not the way I will work. If I have a pot scratcher that scratches on the strings, there's no discernible pitch in the traditional sense. It's just like some kind of noise that comes in. So fiddle will still derive some kind of a fundamental out of this crap that's coming in and saying, oh, this is a F sharp or whatever. But, this is really not so controllable. But I have the feeling that the way how I work with my gadgets on my guitar after 15 years, I have some kind of a feeling and can predict what will happen. Not exactly as I say, like there's an F sharp, but whether, for example, fiddle gives me a lot of crappy data that's coming out and goes all over the place, or whether it's more steady, stuff like this, I have a feeling for.
Right. I think for those people that aren't familiar with the Max Object Fiddle, it's something that was developed by Miller Puckett. It's a pitch tracker. And it's a pitch tracker that just generates a ton of information about the data that it sees coming in through, say, a microphone. And but as you say, if you feed it sort of nonsense material, it will try really, really hard to give you a pitch, right? But what I think is interesting about that is that if you consciously try to make a pitch, you're going to pretty much hit it every time, and fiddle is going to pretty much detect it at the same every time.
Yes.
But when you attack something with this kind of random noisiness stuff, every time you work with it, it's going to give you different results.
Yeah, exactly. Although the question is, what is a different result? If I say like, oh, with my pot scratcher example, I know that it gives me totally a lot of data and all over the frequency range and as much as possible. This is something that I want to have at this point, of course.
Right.
And this is, if I want to have that, then it's predictable.
Right, indeed. Well, I guess the reason I think of it in terms of not predictable results is that it's sort of unpredictable in the same way that, like, say, circuit bending is not predictable. If you're doing circuit bending, when you go to kind of like, lay a wet cloth on a certain part of the circuit, it'll react similarly, but it'll never give you the exact same squeals and farts and stuff, right?
Yeah, right.
And so what it strikes me is that your use of fiddle is almost like a computer-based circuit bending. Because of the way that you approach it. That's really interesting. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, but then there's also, I need to add here, and we're coming back to another important thing I wanted to, explain with this article, where I want to go into what is actually interactivity here.
Right.
And I say that I program deliberately some controlled randomness into the machine so that it surprises me constantly. And I am, as I said before, I'm sitting at the edge of my seat. I have to be alert and awake to really, so that I stay on top of what I'm doing and not falling back into like the same routine over and over again. Going back here towards the end of the 90s, I also felt that my improvisations were very predictable. If improvisation is just something that you say, I'm just not writing it down, and you have a finite amount of musical expressions, like in a toolbox, and it's just like you take your tools every time out of the box, but just you rearrange them every time, well, then it is an open form composition.
Right.
That was okay. But in my case, it became boring. I think it became also boring for my listeners. And it is really, and it has, just would simply say it's a matter of personality. I can work very well with like uncertainty, with things that I have no idea how to solve a problem right now. And it actually, in my music, is clearly visible that if things happen, if problems arise, something breaks, if something's happening that I do not immediately know how to handle, then my performances are actually getting better because it keeps me alert. So you could, of course, write a software that does exactly what you want all the time. But I know that in my case, it would get boring, predictable, and I would repeat myself over and over again. Instead of having everything as controllable as possible, I put some controlled randomness into the machine so that it is not always doing what I want, but sometimes surprises me with some totally different outcome. And that helps.
Sure.
And I do it also with other ensembles when I conduct my 16-piece chamber ensemble or my 15-piece electronic ensemble or so. If things are happening that are mistakes or something's breaking, somebody does something unexpected, somebody does something that was just a mistake or something, it's actually good. It always keeps me awake.
Right. I think that's really an interesting point, because what it also shows is your development as an artist and how that kind of is different from the way other artists approach their craft. So for a lot of musicians, one of the goals is to become good enough at your instrument and good enough at a style of music so that you can play things without making mistakes. And as I think you identified, one of the things that happens is you lose the sense of risk. And when you lose the sense of risk, you start boring yourself. Yeah. And I think that the audiences get tuned into that immediately. I've always felt like audiences are at the peak of their attention at their peak when they're sitting on their edges of the seat, wondering if you're going to go down in a great big ball of flames, right?
Yeah. I think it is something that transpires through the room, whether you're like another concert like this, snore away, press your buttons, or if you're like alert, if you're there and, the tension is there. And like the audience, I see it also when I'm at concerts.
Right, sure. So let's talk a little bit about your ensembles, your large format ensembles. You have two of them, the Third Eye Chamber Orchestra and the Dark Circuits Orchestra. First of all, what's the difference between the two?
The Third Eye Orchestra is the ensemble of acoustic instruments, a chamber ensemble, with live sound processing, which Daphna is doing because she's specialized in that. Right. The other ensemble is all electronics, mostly or usually with people who build their own instruments. I find one of the most interesting things with electronic music performers is that we still have so many people who design their instruments. And but recently I had also David Watts on bagpipe with it. So probably the Dark Circuits Orchestra will morph into all electronics with one acoustic instrument, while the other one is all acoustic with one electronic instrument. Both
I see.
Both have what I call myself the third eye concept. I write the materials out for the entire ensemble for usually 1 hour performances. But these are all on individual sheets of paper that are numbered with letters and numbers. And I improvise as somebody who puts these, calls these units in with flashcards and hand signs, which there's only like a few, play E2, and I count them in or something. So that it's a real open form composition in that the material will be played. Some of the material will be played several times. Other material might not get played. Nobody knows how I start, how I end, what's happening in the middle. But I improvise as the conductor and put it all together live on stage. Again, this is the way for me to work, because if I write stuff out, and I had that already with my jazz performances, if I write it all out, it gets boring already when I go on stage and have to play it a second time.
Right. Now, the material that you're writing for people, is it standard notation, or are you doing like graphical notation, or do you mix and match, or do you do like Pauline Oliveira's like word style, word poem work?
For the chamber ensemble, it's all written and arranged to the entire ensemble: string quartet, wind quartet, several keyboard synthesizer, then voice, and so on. For the electronic ensemble, it's graphic notation and sometimes words, that text that I wrote down with telling them, like, play a field recording sample with natural sounds, stuff like that.
I see. Interesting. So it's, in terms of like visualizing this in my head, when you talk about the chamber ensemble, it's easy to imagine, these different groupings and the pianos and the bass and this kind of stuff, because we all recognize what those instruments are. With the dark circuits, you're saying that a lot of these things are sort of like personally built. How do you know even the capability of the instruments that the players have, so that you can write for it, or you can, because even if you're improvising, you kind of have to do it in a way that honors the instrument that the person has in front of them, right?
Yeah. There are two ways to handle it that I'm doing. First is, well, the Dark Circuits Orchestra has been mostly a workshop orchestra before, but now it's an orchestra of more or less fixed people who I know for a long time, and in most cases, I played with them also for a long time, so I know what they're doing. This is one approach. Like Michael Vorfeld with his light bulbs, I play with this guy since 1992.
Sure.
Second, I meet with everybody beforehand. And before, when I did my large performance last year at iBeam, I met with them for a long time, discussing all the little details and asking them even some simple questions with like, how do you control your volume? Because if you work with student ensembles, they have no idea, should I control my volume? But Matthew Ostrovsky gives you an answer like, with my little pinky.
Right.
Some deep motion controller to control and stuff. Or you get, it just like really, you should look at the notes that I did when I talked to my people from this ensemble, what weird answers I got. And of course, some people do not do certain things. Some people do not do rhythms. Others do not do glissandi. So these things have to be considered, and you have to examine and interview everybody a long time beforehand, and then write the score.
Right. Okay. That's why I asked, because like you mentioned, one of the instructions might be to play a sample of a field recording of a nature sound, except if that player doesn't have access to samples, that would be a little rough. But I see what you're saying is, especially if you have an ensemble that's pretty much a set cast, they represent probably just about as stable of groupings as your winds and your strings in the Third Eye Orchestra, right?
Exactly. And I mean, you approach the string quartet differently than the bass clarinets in that section. And here in the Dark Circuits Orchestra, you approach the people who can do samples differently than the ones that are more in the circuit bendy kind of area. Yes.
Right. That's actually interesting, and it makes a lot of sense on how you could manage about the biggest electronic group I've heard of to date. So, well, we're just about done with our time this evening, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. I am curious, because you are, to me, one of the people that really is on the front edge of a lot of experimentalism, and also having a really deep history, so that there's a lot of depth to the work that you do. I'm curious what you see as the most fertile areas of exploration for the future. And I'm thinking kind of the near future rather than the way out future.
Oh, that's a good question. I have no idea. It's
that's a great answer. I really appreciate that answer.
Well, first is I can give you, of course, my personal area where I need to go, and this is like I'm really working more with my large ensembles right now. But in terms of like looking to the future, my favorite story is the idea when people came up with airplanes. And of course, when people came up with airplanes, it became so clear that the nation states will disappear because we can now fly over the borders. And you and I know where this ended up. You put a machine gun on your airplane, and then the whole theory is out of the window.
Right.
And so then I'm like always, if I get asked like, how will the future look? That always comes to my mind. I had done so many predictions in my life, was turned out differently, So I don't know. My students right now want to work with a Mayo. So maybe there's still something to be done in the area of controlling your computer with anything else than the computer keyboard. I don't know.
Going back to your Endangered Guitar system a little bit, what are the external controllers that you use to control the computer? I mean, when I look at the array of your playing area, you have a lot of things that you used for sort of prepared guitar type work, or like you said, the pot scrubbers and stuff like that. But you don't really, it doesn't seem like you have a big array of like controllers or anything.
I had worked with a bunch of controllers on and off, which is you could see it like, hey, you play a piece for a while and then you don't play the piece anymore. For a while I had an infrared sensor from Infusion Systems in front of me that allowed me to turn things on and off with my head movements. That's what I used it for. I have used accelerometers at the beginning. I have experimented with a lead motion controller. I have done a lot with an iPhone, because an iPhone, if you put a metal case around it and use the accelerometer, it's like a very good bottleneck that you can use and then move around. But each one of these, a year or two, and then I got tired of it.
Right. So, yeah, that seems to be, and maybe that is a pointer for the future, which is that it seems like with a lot of these controller systems, they do have a relatively short shelf life because there's a difference between a controller box with knobs on it, or keys, or buttons, or pads, and something like a guitar. There's something about a guitar that screams instrument that no box of knobs seems to yet have captured. And
it's a subtlety into it that you can't get with anything with a box. Yeah.
Is there anything that you've tried or you've felt? So as a guitarist especially, you're kind of tuned in to the feel of playing and the feel of, of change. Is there anything that you've worked with that really struck you as saying, well, this could actually become an instrument?
No, I could also add the Kinect to my list, and the Cuneo that I'm still working with when I'm not using the guitar, but I process somebody else.
Oh, okay.
This is all. It's not the same. And then I was experimenting with an iPad and the Concrete Performer, which is very interesting because it's like the old Lemur many years ago. Right. You can put all your 10 fingers on it and move. It's all cool, but it's not still the subtlety that I'd like to have. At some point, we have probably like brain controllers that really work. Although with the brain controllers that I have worked in the past, they don't work with me because I don't seem to have a brain. There's nothing.
Yeah, I'm always afraid to use one of those because I'm scared to find out exactly how little activity there really is.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you so much again for the time. This was a fascinating look into your work, as well as kind of the arc and vector of your growth. And I think it's always interesting for people to hear how others go through that, because it kind of informs us of possibilities for ourselves. So I want to thank you for opening those doors for us.
Great, and thanks for having me.
All right. Well, I will talk to you soon.
Take care.
So that's Hans' story. I'm pretty sure he's sticking to it. I have a bunch of links for his stuff, including that article that I mentioned from the Prepared Guitar. Please feel free to check it out. It's on artmusictech.libsyn.com, and you'll find the links there. It's the links that you'll get if you check out the postings on Twitter or on Facebook. Thank you so much for listening. Keep on keeping on, and keep on sharing this with your friends, family, enemies, whoever you can get to listen. That's great. And I will talk to you next week. Bye.